Fourth, uncertainty acceptance and uncertainty avoidance. This has to do with how many rules are there for society. So if you have an uncertainty avoidance society, this is something like Singapore. If you've been there, you may know it's against the law to chew gum. Good reason for that. But there's a lot of rules in Singapore. And over here we say, well, sort of live your life how you want and do what you want, whatever floats your boat. So across this spectrum you find all societies, and it's the fourth way of telling the difference in the culture of the country you're about to enter. So here we've got the US. We're pretty much on the left end, and this, it looks like we're in the middle. But relative to most countries, we accept uncertainty in the US. We are a country of immigrants. We allow people to live their lives relatively however they wish. We are a very heterogeneous society relative to most. So you're going to find Japan over to the right of us for sure. And Japan has a very narrow way of doing things relative to other societies. As a matter of fact, there's a term for it called kata, which means a routine. But you're not going to Japan or the US, but you're probably from them, and that's why I want you to understand your society. Now we put Brazil up there and discover that they really are quite a good distance over here. I mean, believe me, the Japanese are far on this end. And the Brazilians, then what they're saying is there's a certain way to do things in Brazil. There is a procedure relative to these societies like the US, Canada, Australia, and Great Britain. These guys have a format, a way of doing things that is standard, and it doesn't change much. Most countries have those four. There's a few that have this fifth dimension, and Brazil does, so I've added it for you. I think this has a lot to do with culture. Short-term and long-term orientation. Well, if you're thinking with me, you can guess where America's going to appear here. We're going to be way on that end over there, and yes, we are. We think very short-term, and the Japanese think very long-term. Almost all Asian societies think more long-term than we do in America and British societies, okay? Where are the Brazilians? They're relatively closer to the Japanese. So those of you who boarded the boat from these kinds of cultures, when you go to Brazil, you're in this culture, and they're thinking much more long-term than you are. And they think of time that they don't own time, that time owns them. There's more to be said about that, but we don't have a lot of time to get into it today, to tell you the truth. But just take it for granted. When you're in Brazil, there's going to be a higher power distance. They think more like the group. They think more of an equal outcome. They avoid uncertainty, and they think more long-term than you if you come from an American society. That's culture. Political system. It's much like probably the country you're from. It is a federal republic with 26 states and a federal district. Chief of State is President Dilma Rousseff. She was just reelected about 6 weeks ago to her second term. The head of government she is also Dilma Rousseff. The Constitution was created in 1988. It has two congressional houses, much like the U.S. or probably the country you're from. 81 senators and 513 deputies. Where'd our picture of our president go? We lost her there. She was there for a minute. But that's all right. I wanted to talk about the flag anyway. I think the Brazilian flag is fascinating. The green represents the green of the Amazon. The yellow represents the minerals of the country, gold, tin, copper, all kinds of ore. This says order and progress across the middle here in Portuguese. There are 27 stars because there's 26 states and a federal republic. There's only one above this white line, which means there's one above the equator, and that's Para, the largest state, the state where the Amazon is. This is something that you'll see on this trip that you can only see in certain parts of the world. There are 5 stars here in the middle that make up the Southern Cross. So if you're from the Northern Hemisphere, you're accustomed to the Big Dipper pointing to the North Star. Now in the Southern Hemisphere, you see all different stars because you're in a different half of the planet. And then in the south of the equator, you can see the Southern Cross. So on a dark night out on the deck of the ship, you need to look for the Southern Cross. And the stars at the bottom point to the Southern Star, which is that one right there. And it represents one of the states also. It gets very complex after that. Each of them represent a specific state, and man, it gets complex. Anyway, that's the flag. Oh, and this is interesting too. This is the House of Congress in Brasilia. Almost all countries populate the coast. The US is that way, China is that way. Almost every major city is on a port. Most of them seaports. You've noticed if you cruise, that's where you cruise into a seaport in a major city. Brazil had the same problem, so to speak, that they had crowding in the coasts, but open space in the middle of the country. They said, let's put our capital in the middle of the country. They created a new city called Brasilia and moved the government there, and that's where this is. Now, the problem is a lot of the secretaries in the government had the power to keep where they were. They'd much rather live in Rio de Janeiro than in Brasilia, because Rio de Janeiro is a beautiful city and Brasilia was a new created city that nobody cared for that much. So it really was sort of a social science experiment that didn't work out well, but that's Brasilia. Yeah. Okay, Brazil. There we go. Religion, yeah, this is going to be predictable. 74% Catholic, but it's a little different perhaps than the Catholic you come from because, again, of this mixing of the Catholicism from the Spanish, or from the Portuguese, and the African religions that were brought by the slaves. So when you continue to think about this, mixing has a lot to do with the country here. It's 15% Protestant. Yeah. The economy. Back to this mixing thing before I get into a number. It's the country is 55% white and 40% mulatto and only 6% black. Okay, so just about everybody you see in Brazil is going to be some kind of a mix of people. In Argentina and Chile, that's not the case. That's not the case. And that's why Brazil is so interesting, I tend to think, right? Oh, the other integration you get there. Let me go back to religion. Is that where I was? Yeah. So Easter. Before Easter, you go on Lent in the Catholic tradition. So you have a big blowout, a big party before you go on Lent, and it's called Carnival. That's the interesting mix, because Catholicism has Easter, but the party that you have before you go on Lent for Easter is Carnival. Carna means flesh. It's a celebration of the flesh. That comes from the Western Africa slave tradition of having a huge social party. Yeah, there you go. That's the mix. Interesting. All right, now the economy. Their GDP is $3 trillion. Give you some comparisons. The GDP of the United States is $17 trillion. GDP of Texas, the state of Texas where I live, is $1 trillion. So it's 3 times that. $3 trillion, 6th largest in the world. So it's the 5th largest population with the 6th largest GDP. Their GDP purchase price parity is what that means. What it means is, if you put it in US dollars, how much would they make? This number in the US is about 51,000. So the Brazilians make 15,000. Of the 3 countries we're going to look at today, the PPP is the lowest in Brazil than in Argentina and Chile. 15,000 per person. Unemployment rate's about 6.9%. Inflation is 6.2, which is not too bad for this country. If you know their history, they've had a history of terrible inflationary pressures, which, matter of fact, they had to change the currency from the cruzeiro to the real. Just totally changed. And it's created a lot of the retail culture, too. When inflation was so wild, people would spend money as quickly as they could. Well, this, even though their economy has settled down, this culture of spending quickly has not changed. And you'll notice it in Brazil. The way people shop, the size of the packages, it's just fascinating. Their growth was 2.5% in 2013. That's pretty good. Just 10 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, they say in 2014 it's not going to be as hot. They've got some problems coming up. The real, this is their currency. The real is 2.5 to the US dollar. The real, then when it's plural, it's Reis, R-E-I-A-S, but they pronounce it in an unusual way that I have trouble pronouncing. To me, it sounds like Reis. That's the plural for real. Real means the royal, or, in European countries, it'll be the crown or the krona. That's what royal means. The royal sign has been on the economy. Economic freedom. How is the country doing? They used to be moderately free. They've moved to mostly unfree. The country is not doing well in that regard. They've moved backwards. There's this measure that we use in economics here called economic freedom, which comes from heritage.org if you want to look it up. There's 177 countries along this spectrum from constrained to free. Their score is 57, but again, that doesn't mean anything to you until you look at this number. Of the 177 countries along this spectrum, there are 114, meaning number 1 is the freest country in the world. That's Hong Kong, by the way. And number 177 is the least free. This is not a good number. I've done some study of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. All of them occur somewhere around 100 to 120. They're not very free. They're relatively constrained. This is not a very good number. Here's the 4 things that make that up, though. One is rule of law. Unfortunately, Brazil has a relatively corrupt government, so the rule of law is not very consistent. Government size is 39% of the GDP. On its own, that's not that bad. You would hope the developing country, though, that they'd be able to keep this down in the teens. You know, most of you come from a developed country where, you know, if a third of the GDP goes to the government, that's okay. But back when our countries were developing, in the 19 teens, 1910, 1920, our government consumed about 15%. Now that most of us come from rich countries, a third is okay. In poor countries, it's not. So that is an extremely high number. That's far too high. Their debt to GDP is 69%. I wish my country had that. In the U.S., we just went over 100. We're at 105 as of today. So that's not too bad, but you know, it's certainly holding the country back. Regulatory efficiency, they are not transparent. There's a great deal of labor inflexibility. Labor laws are very strict. Labor taxes are very high. It's very hard to move labor around. It takes 100 days to start a business. That's a crime. That's really, really severe. So the economy can't grow because of the regulatory efficiency. It's not very efficient. It discourages production. Open markets, they're not very open. They're better than they used to be. Their tariff rate is 7.9. To give you a comparison, in the U.S., it's 1.9, but that's really, really low. The U.S. is very, very, very low. Mostly government banking. That's really not good for the system either because it's too highly regimented and regulated and controlled.